Now, I'm from Kansas, and many people have their stereotype of Kansas from, as we know that from Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. You know, I want to be honest with you, a lot of western Kansas looks exactly like that. But I'm from Lawrence, and we have our own little mountain, Mount Oread. So I feel very comfortable. You've made me very comfortable here. If you think about it, I'm from one of the very few mountains, little mountains in Kansas. So I'm just think of me as a Kansas hilltopper. That's what I am here today. Now, I'm going to talk to you about a real crisis in American society, and it's not what you think. So I'm going to have some good news, and I'm going to have some bad news, and I'm going to have some worse news, and I'm going to have some better news. My good news is on many of the long-term solutions to problems we face in the United States, we pretty much know the answer. We know that we need to find a way to invest more in infrastructure. We know that we need to find a way to invest more in science. We know that tax reform that cuts a bunch of loopholes. I can go on and on and on. Well, if that's the good news, it's going to be an awful dull talk. The bad news is we are absolutely terrible at persuading people to do these sensible things. Absolutely terrible at persuading people. And the worst news is that if you look all around American society, I don't see us getting better. Now, I'm from Kansas, and there have been 3 times where I've been traveling in Europe where I have had to pretend I was from Canada. And the reason for that is that in Kansas, we had just changed our biology curriculum to not teach evolution. And people in the rest of the world look at me and say, "What century are you from?" So I pretended I was a Canadian. That was the only way out of this. Were we doing that because we didn't know better in Kansas? Well, no, we knew better. But in fact, I have been asked, and I advise some of the people on this on occasion, the biologists. And my first piece of advice to them was, stop calling the other side stupid as your main strategy, and try to reach out to them. And that's where I get to the better news. That there are basic principles of communication that work in all instances. Like I say, I'm from Kansas. I've done a lot of advocacy training, and I've almost always worked with groups that are hated in Kansas. So think about this. I've worked with scientists and engineers. They're not very popular. I've worked with lawyers. They're less popular. And worst of all, I've worked with, brace yourself for this, Democrats in Kansas, who technically are protected under the National Endangered Species Act. There are so few Democrats outside what is fondly called the People's Republic of Lawrence, where I'm from. But the good news is that the basic principles of advocacy that I'm going to tell you about apply in all those contexts. And they tell you how to make the most persuasive case you can possibly do. And like I say, I've done quite a lot of training. Also car dealers. It's an odd story. Where do you find the most basic principles of advocacy? Well, where do you find Big Bird? Where in the old days did you find Jim Lehrer? Where did you find Julia Child in the old days? Where do you find Masterpiece or Masterpiece Mystery? Well, somebody's bound to know. It's only one place you find all those things. PBS. You say, now you've stolen all my thunder. Because the basic principles of designing effective advocacy in any context are to first think about your purpose, to then think about the barriers to achieving that purpose, and to then think about strategies that are well designed to overcome those barriers in order to achieve the purpose. Now, I want to illustrate the importance of purpose first with a hypothetical example. And maybe some of you, at least at my university, it is very common in science or other classes that students will have to go through a safety training program. Do any of you have to do it? Typically, it's an online computer self-taught thing. Does this ring any kind of bell to many of you? Okay, when you've gone through that training program, those of you who've done it, has it been a computer thing where you click through it? Okay, let's think about that. What is the purpose of that training program? If it were to make sure that you're prepared in the case of an accident and whatever. You see, the good thing about rhetoric classrooms is we have accidents too, but they rarely require a trip to the emergency room. If the purpose is to prepare you in case of something terrible, you'd role play. You'd practice what happened and do it repetitively, so you'd be prepared the way an airplane pilot is prepared if something goes wrong, like that pilot over the Hudson a few years ago. He didn't think, he reacted. But if you're just going through a computer program, what does that tell you? The real purpose, and that's a communication event. What does that tell you the real purpose of that is? Do they care if you learn something? Or do they care if you go through it and click the final box at the end? So what's the real purpose? Is it to protect you, or is it to protect against liability? To protect against liability. So my point is, if you're designing effective communication, you've got to first think about all your purposes in designing that. Now, I want to give a political example and then a more real-world example. Tomorrow night we're going to have the first presidential debate. What are Mitt Romney's purposes in that debate? You tell me. We'll get to the rocket science questions later, which is, it's fortunate that this isn't rocket science, because even NASA's mostly given up on rocket science now. Literally, we use the Russians to get up to the space station. Okay, he wants to win the presidential debate and persuade voters to change their mind. What other purposes does he have? If he's going to win the debate, does that mean he should be as aggressive as possible? Why shouldn't he necessarily be as aggressive as possible? Do you like it when your friends, you say something and they say back to you, that's wrong for these 6 reasons? Or do they become formal? Do you like that from your parents? Do you like it when your parents correct you and point out when you're wrong? I don't know anybody who likes that. I'm beginning to make the point that he has multiple purposes. That he's got to persuade people to change their mind. He's got to humanize himself so that people like him more than they like the president. He's got to convince them that he has sensible policy answers that'll move us forward. And notice some of these purposes are a little bit inconsistent. Humanizing and giving policy details, very, very different things. And the important point for all of us more broadly is to think about our purposes. Now let me mention a set of different purposes that are very common in communication events, and then let me give you a real-world example. So the most obvious purpose, the one everybody always thinks about, is persuasive advocacy to change people's mind. But equally important, and something in many ways more common, is persuasive advocacy to reinforce what you already believe. Perhaps you've heard the phrase preaching to the choir or preaching to the saved. My first school, I taught for 5 years at Baylor, and it was a private religious school, and literally freshmen were required to go to chapel. I don't know how I made it out of there alive. But the preaching to the choir is very different than changing people's minds. When I talk to Kansas Democrats, the first thing I always tell them is they need to talk more like Ronald Reagan. And they say to me, but I hate that. And I say, well, do you want to win or do you want to lose? If you're happy losing, if you're happy marching together and being very excited, let's not do that. The kinds of things you say that are energetic, that make your own crowd happy, are usually not the things that are going to make people change their minds. So you've got to think about your purpose. But in addition to purpose, and those two purposes, you have purposes like presentation of information. I did training for many years for the KBA, which is the Kansas Bar Association, and I want to emphasize to you they were the lawyers, not the innkeepers. And one of the things they focused on was continuing legal education. A typical continuing legal education program would be a 3-hour seminar with perhaps 400 slides. I made the point to them that by slide 6, you'd kind of a donut effect. You'd watch as everyone in the audience glazed over. And 400 slides, nobody can process anything about that. And I tried to convince them that what they needed to do if they're presenting information was far less material, focused, with written handouts which gave people other sources, and group projects in the middle to emphasize the importance of things. That worked for about a year, and then they forgot about it because slides were easier. The important point I'm making is you got to think about what you're trying to do. The first example, which I saw you shake your head up that you'd been through this, is presentation of rules, a safety presentation. And if you're going to do that right, you have to do that with multiple methods. Sometimes your purpose in talking is not to talk, but to gather information. Sometimes your purpose is to make relationships, or to make contacts, or to reinforce those relationships. So let's imagine through, let us say, odd decision making here at Western, that you are sending a faculty representative to testify before the legislature on literacy and higher education, and the accident is Dr. Jerome.
That would be an accident.
Yeah. I mean, things happen. What would be her purposes in talking to the legislature, a legislative committee, about the status of higher education in Kentucky? You've heard of the legislature? It's where the money comes from. Just saying.
Get more money.
Okay, so you have a persuasive purpose to get more money. Is that going to be your only purpose? So what other things is she going to want to do in terms of purpose to persuade the legislature? And by the way, does persuasion usually work? Sometimes when you want something from your parents, do you have to talk them through it about a dozen times before you finally convince them to do it? You know, let me tell you, legislatures are not that different than parents or anybody else. So maybe her purpose is to not actually win in this instance, but to set the seeds of something that's going to come later. So besides those two purposes, what other purposes does she have? What kind of image of all of you does she want to take to the legislature?
That it's going to be used wisely.
Okay, that you're going to spend the money wisely. And is Western already doing a good job, but could do a lot better job if they had a little bit more? I gather that's true of the way Angie's shaking her head and the room's moving. And then, does Angie have any other purposes? Does Angie want to make a strong presentation so that she comes across as a leader in higher education, as somebody the legislative committee might want to consult? Of course she does. About 20 years ago, I did a presentation much like this one to all the Democrats in a local county, and somebody was there in the audience who I didn't know from Adam ended up to be their congressional candidate, became a dear personal friend. I worked with him in all 6 of his successful campaigns, and I learned an awful lot of that from that accident. But my purpose there was to make connections as well as it was to present material. So the important point is you have to think about your purposes, and oftentimes there are going to be multiple purposes. And oftentimes you're going to recognize that what you really want to achieve, you want the legislature to say, oh my word, you're right, our priorities are wrong, we're building too many prisons and not supporting enough colleges, let us change our priorities. That's probably not going to happen in a single Hosanna down from the mountain moment. But over time, things like that do happen. So at that point, the second step is to think about the barriers to achieving those purposes. So now let me venture once with trepidation, since you did not seem especially interested, back to the presidential campaign. And with both candidates, what kinds of, and let me first tell you some barriers. I'll go through and list kind of a typology of barriers. The most obvious barriers would be negative attitudes or negative values about the issue in question. Or negative beliefs. Beliefs are statements of fact, things that are in principle testable. So like gun control doesn't work, or gun control does work. Attitudes are evaluations of beliefs. I hate gun control. I have a brother-in-law who was in the special forces in Southeast Asia in the Vietnam era, and he has many weapons, and he has a television that will only pick up the Fox News channel, and so we talk a lot about the cowboys when I'm there. I don't bring up gun control or other issues. I'm making the point that attitudes are very, very hard to change, and values are just more basic versions of attitudes. Sometimes you have cultural differences. I did not understand in my first several years at Baylor what an intensely religious environment it was. And sometimes you will have the audiences with different expectations and different experiences. You also will have multiple audiences. So sometimes I will give talks to people where, for example, I'm going to talk later today about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I sometimes will have audiences where a third of them are highly informed about the nature of that conflict, but a third of the people have just wandered off from the street and couldn't figure out where Israel and Palestine are on the map if they had help, a lot of help, and that creates a real problem for you. Sometimes you have audiences that are incredibly apathetic about, of course I bring this on myself by bringing up a political issue with a younger audience. You have a problem of people being uninformed about things, and the level of public information on almost all questions of public policy, that's something I'm going to talk about tonight, is woefully low. Woefully low. Sometimes people in the audience dislike the individual. I mean, there are my brother-in-law. If Bill Clinton were to cure cancer and reinvigorate NASA and personally solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, my brother-in-law would say, "Show off. I still hate him." And I bet you know people like that who feel that way about President Clinton. And then there is anxiety on the part of somebody. I don't know, I've given a million talks like this, but still, before every one of them, I'm pumping myself up. I think everybody should do that. And finally, let me mention environmental distractions. When I teach at summer at KU, I believe the people in facilities operations wait to schedule their construction process until they know where I'm teaching and at what time, and then they do one classroom a floor above and one a floor below while I'm teaching. I swear to you that is true. Now, I've gone through about 20 different rhetorical barriers in about 4.5 minutes, so that you can help me and tell me, let's go back to Mitt Romney. You all know who he is. What are the barriers he has to overcome if he's going to be successful tomorrow night? Think about those barriers, especially our attitudes about him and our attitudes about where the Republican candidate stands. And for equal time, we'll do the same thing briefly to the president. The American people, have they fallen in love with Mitt Romney?
No.
Why not?
As well.
Pardon me?
Stereotypes about as well.
Stereotypes about as well. Has he done anything to feed those stereotypes?
$47.
He made in a campaign debate. He offered to bet the other candidate $10,000. You know, I must say I left that in my other pair of pants. I mean, who could do that? And he was making the point that he and his family owned American cars. Does anybody remember how he said it?
Several.
He said his wife has a couple caddies. He said, and you may have heard that his house in California, they have an elevator for people and another one for cars. Yeah, well, there you go. So he's got to overcome the stereotype, but he's really not like us, right? I mean, anybody here have a house where you need an elevator because you got so many floors? No, not me. Okay, what else does he have to overcome?
47% speech.
Okay, and so that is the perception that he doesn't care about a huge percentage of the American people. Is that a fair way to put it? That's where he said 47% of the people are dependent on government, and there was nothing he could do to persuade them, and they liked being dependent on government. It turned out, when you looked at the math, a lot of those people who are dependent on government were people on Social Security, veterans benefits, and in my experience, elderly veterans do not view themselves that way. I don't know about you. Students. What else?
Religion.
The thing that's funny about the religious barrier, because he's a Mormon, is that's more from fellow Republicans, and he's got to overcome that to make sure they'll go out and vote. Because if they don't vote, I know this phrase because it applies to him, and it applied to the defensive backfield for the Kansas City Chiefs yesterday. He, like the Chiefs backfield, he will be toast. I mean, we were burned so badly. Oh my! We scored after it was 20-0 against us. That's the good news. We did not score often. That's the bad news. Well, I think you've given, I think a couple other barriers. Don't you think you would be anxious before debating in front of 50, 60, 70 million people for the first time? I know I would be. And so all of those are barriers. Now, let's be honest. The president has some barriers too. What kind of barriers does he face? Anybody think the economy's doing good?
No.
Anybody who thinks it wouldn't be a whole lot better if we were creating a lot more good jobs? Some of you seniors, soon to be seniors? Do you wish the job market were a lot stronger than it is out there? Oh gosh, yes. I've got graduate students who are looking for jobs, and I definitely wish that job market were a lot. So that's a big barrier. What else?
Healthcare.
A lot of people don't like his signature program, the healthcare initiative. What else?
Spending.
A lot of people think spending's out of control. A lot of people have trouble connecting with him, especially working class people. You know, and I think partially that, I mean, don't you think that race is still an issue for some people? I mean, I'm not saying across the board, but for some people. And then my brother-in-law forwarded me an email about, quote, Michelle Obama's high school reunion that, surely people don't really, you can kind of imagine what it was, but I'm not going to tell you. Are there people out there like that? Apparently there are. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who don't like him because he kind of comes across as distant and elitist and professorial. I always tell anybody who thinks Obama is professorial, you should go into a real seminar in a doctoral program. Obama is not professorial. Okay, doctoral program jokes don't work at all. You live and you learn, you know. So, when you think about those barriers, it should be immediately shaping you to the kinds of things you should do if you were each of those two candidates. But I want to pick on Dr. Jerome again. Now, he's back at that legislative committee, and we've figured out what she wants to accomplish. What barriers does she face in the long term, persuading the legislators that they need to change their priorities, either by raising taxes or by change their priorities to support more for higher education? You probably would like more support for higher education. I bet you'd like more state support so that tuition doesn't have to go up as much, or more scholarship support, or more faculty members so you had a chance for more classes.
They're probably uninformed about what's going on here at Western.
They probably are. And in general, I mean, at least in Kansas, the legislators, many of them are from areas where many of them don't have higher education. They don't live in a district where there's a major university, and so they don't know about things. Doesn't mean that's not bad. That's just where they're from. What else?
They might be UK fans.
Okay. In my state, it's K-State versus KU, and there's. And if you think about it, that's silly. I mean, this is a state big enough for multiple universities, and Kentucky's the same way. But boy, that's not the way partisans think, is it? And old wounds, they fester, don't they? So, what else? Is spending more money popular now? Anybody like paying more taxes? Anybody? So that's a problem. So, and are there any negative perceptions of higher education out there that legislators might have?
Yeah, that we're not doing enough.
You're not doing enough. You're not rigorous
It's
enough.
our fault.
You're not working hard enough.
Other perceived self-interest. She's a faculty member.
Yeah, right. I mean, you're so overpaid. Yes, I look in my checkbook and I say, well, I do not need advanced math skills to deal with this. But the fact that something isn't true doesn't mean it's not a barrier. Right? Think how many people believed Sarah Palin when she said there were death panels in the health care law that wasn't remotely true. But a huge percentage. Think how many people still believe the president was born in Kenya or some other place. The fact that it isn't true doesn't mean it's a barrier. Okay, she's testifying before the legislature. I admit this hasn't happened in a while, but don't you think they're going to wonder how can she be representing Western when she's so young? I made you so young, Angie. And I would bet in Kentucky, in Kansas, the legislature, let me say it this, it does not over-represent women.
Yeah.
And if that is the case in Kentucky, are there any barriers that women face that men don't face?
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. A man who is forceful is what? strong-willed, independent, passionate. A woman who is forceful is, well,
A B word.
yeah, I bet some of you filled in that B word. Beautiful was what I had in mind. That's the way I thought it, but I'm not sure that's the word all of you filled in. So there really are gender issues that apply to women that do not apply to men. And if you doubt that, let me just say this: how many of the men have ever been on an internship, working in the summer for someplace, and had one of the bosses say something dismissive or commented on your appearance in a way that made you feel uncomfortable? I've never had a male student say that it's ever happened, and I want to tell you, nobody's ever called me little fella either. How many of the women here have had that? Now, you may be shy since I'm from another university, but in my classes, at least 1/3 of the women always raise their hand that has happened to them. So gender issues are still out there. We made progress, but we are definitely not to the promised land. And so she's going to have some significant barriers relating to all these issues that she's got to overcome. Now, so far, I've been focused on the first two stages, but if I'm going to be right that there's going to be good news, I better talk about strategies. And I want to give it to you in the form of news, because I think there are 4 cardinal points, like the 4 cardinal points on the compass, except I want to go north, east, west, and south, which spells the news, and the 4 most basic points of communication, of effective advocacy. The first one is one that I always explain to Kansas Democrats that they might not like, but the world didn't much care, that you have to start with where the audience is. You have to start with the barriers that are there and accept them. I always compare this to gravity. I want you to think really, really hard that you don't like gravity. Bear with me. Think really, really hard. The pen didn't seem to care that you didn't like gravity. Angie, you've seen me do that many times in class. Yeah, and so you have to start with where the audience is. And if the audience is uninformed, you have to find a way to inform them, a way that doesn't come across like you're being a professor and talking down to them. If they're against your attitudes, you've got to find a way to adapt to their attitudes. So that's the most basic principle. The second principle is that you have to find a way of appealing to both the head and the heart. There's a famous letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the woman he was in love with when he was ambassador to France. I was not there, and it's called the Head and Heart Letters. And there's a lot of persuasion research on this point. In the long term, there's a lot of research that the stronger argument wins out in the long run if you have something new that is relevant that your audience has not heard. For years, I gave as an example a debate that no one's mind was ever changed on: capital punishment. Because I can summarize that debate in about 10 seconds. They're evil criminals and deserve to die versus capital punishment is inhumane and they might not all be guilty. And then something changed. And that thing that changed was DNA research. And the DNA research demonstrated, as Al Gore would say, the quite inconvenient fact that a lot of people on death row were also innocent. And the trend has been going the other way. Several states have eliminated capital punishment. The governor of Illinois commuted the sentences of everybody who had capital punishment. New facts change the world. Our attitudes about President Bush, the second President Bush, changed dramatically when we discovered there were no weapons of mass destruction. We looked hard. They just weren't there. Suddenly we said, now why do we do this again?